Okay. Okay, so sorry, just getting my head in the game here. Got about a month left in class, I think, a little bit less. But so today, okay, so sorry. I was just checking in with Joe, and it looks like I think we've got most of the major lab ones back. If they're not back, they should be back really soon. Talking last time about qualitative interviewing, right? So that is our number one methodology quantitatively because it's broadly included with things like ethnography, and we use it in lots of cases. It's a fairly cheap, relatively efficient way of getting a lot of rich data, right? Those thick descriptions that we want from people to create our qualitative accounts of things. So I guess we ended off last time. Sorry, I'm flashing back and forth. I'm really sorry. And how we put together an interview guide. And of course, we had our differences between our unstructured and our semi-structured interviews, right? Where unstructured are going to be very short list of questions, Hello, pen. Don't die on me. Sad. Uh-oh. I think I broke PowerPoint. You should go home to Agreed. Goodbye. Oh, damn. Okay. Sorry, that was really good. That was a good joke. That was solid. I liked it.
I don't want to go home.
You don't want to go home?
No, I want to do this.
Okay. We're not really going home. That's not really an option. I'm sorry. Now Joan gave me the giggles with her. Just clear that she hates me a lot. She's like, I can't believe I'm here again with this guy. Oh, it's like, or she really loves social methods. Okay, let's.
I come to class every time I have a test to bully you.
To bully me, right? Yeah, I'm feeling very bullied. Like I said, I'm glad you have a good sense of humor. You give as good as you get, right? Okay, PowerPoint. Revive PowerPoint. We'll try this again. Apparently our exchanges are quite hilarious online because all you hear is my part. You don't hear your part at all. So it's like I'm talking to an imaginary person named Joan. You might for the people who never come to class, you might exist. You might not. Who knows? Okay, there we go. Let's try this again. Make sure my live stream is still working. Looks okay. What the heck? What do I care? Okay. Can I write on the slide now? I can. Huzzah. Okay. Don't worry, Brian. We're here for it. We're here for a long time. Not a good time.
It's all in the narrative.
It's all in the narrative, right? Okay. So your interview guide, if you have a short, an unstructured interview where you're not going in with a lot of prep, right? You're going to have a small, maybe 2-3 kind of question or topic areas you want to talk about. Semi-structured, probably somewhere between 15 to maybe 30 at the outside. Questions. Sorry, I had a hair on my screen. And all of these are always meant to kind of flow, right? It's organic. It's a conversation. You are meant to make conversation with a person, follow up on things that are interesting that they say, and basically you're listening to them, reflecting on what they say, coming up with probing questions if there's issues that they reveal that you want to know more about. It's, none of these are, even semi-structured, it's semi-structured. You're not ever just following your strict list of questions like you would in a structured interview. So I guess we were here. yeah, generally you have some kind of loose order of questioning, but people are going to say things in different orders. They're going to talk about issues that you thought of in your questions. You might switch questions because a follow-up or a different topic area seems like it's more appropriate here. So any order that you establish is always loose. Broad questions, you don't want to be too specific in your questions sometimes because you want to give people a chance to answer organically from their own experiences. No jargon for the I shouldn't say no jargon. Depending on who the person you're talking to is, you can judge the level of language you can use, right? If you're talking about, you're doing interviews about what happened at Boeing to make the 737 MAX a complete death trap, and you're talking to Boeing engineers, you can definitely use engineering language, right? You don't have to put it in common parlance because they're going to understand what you're talking about. But if you're talking to, just an average ordinary person, you want to make sure you're using daily kind of language that people are going to understand without too much jargon. You're going to have to judge this by who you're interviewing. No leading questions. You want to make sure that you're giving people a chance to answer in their own words, that you're not putting words in their mouth, right? You're not wanting to ask, anything like, so we all know that the city council in Edmonton has done a terrible job. How has that terrible job affected you, right? Then you're kind of leading the person into talking about, the terrible job city council has done. I'm not saying they've done a terrible job. I'm just thinking of examples, right? It's like, how can I phrase a leading question? Don't take that as to be my opinion on city council. But yeah, don't lead them, right? Let them answer, ask them broad questions, don't lead them. And yeah, prompts you want to make sure that you get enough context, right? Enough information from the person. And you may have to ask follow-ups for people to flesh out accounts, right? Sometimes when people are answering questions, they kind of assume almost like you were there, or they assume you know the context they're talking about. You want to make sure that you're asking them questions that are going to give you a broad context. And if you're missing details, you're going to want to follow up, right, about whatever topic it happens to be. Okay, so before the interview, so there's a lot of interest, this has changed a lot, I think, in maybe the past 10 to 15 years, and especially in the last 5. This has changed just an enormous amount. So, you want to know a little bit. I think I said last time, generally speaking, you want to do research. When you're talking to people, it's a lot better, and again, it'll get you past some of the tests of competence and the tests of knowledge that people will throw at you. You want to understand the setting that you're going to be talking about. There's very rare times where you're going to be actually just completely lacking in knowledge about where you're going to be doing an interview, or what the topic is, or what that person's experience or their setting is, right? So you want to know a little bit about it so that you kind of understand what people are talking about. They don't have to explain really minute details to you. I talked about when I interviewed one of the execs at Sony that worked in Russia. I had a lot of knowledge about Russian TV and how important this was, so that A, I could pass her competence test, and B, I didn't have to ask mundane little questions about every little thing she was saying, right? You want to make sure that you have some familiarity. Obviously, they're the experts, and you want to hear about their experience, but you also shouldn't come in being like, I really want to talk about, what it's like to live in Lethbridge. I've never been. I have no idea what it's like. Where even is Lethbridge? What is Lethbridge? Why is Lethbridge? That is actually a good question. Why is it still there? It should have blown away off the face of the earth long ago, right? How do they anchor the buildings so that they don't blow away? All of these things, right? But, you wouldn't want to ask someone about their experience of Lethbridge and have just no idea, because then they're going to tell you about, I don't actually know anything about Lethbridge. It's a terrible example for me to choose. I've driven through Lethbridge only a couple of times. But, ask them something about, they tell you something about how the University of Lethbridge is built into cliffs, and you're just like, what? What do you mean? Why so, right? Oh, it's because it's windy, right? All right. So you want to have some sense of the context, so they're not having to walk you through really mundane things. Okay, having good equipment and knowing how to use it. Yeah, nobody wants to sit around where you fumble with a recording device or something and you don't know how stuff works. So any technology that you're using, test it, right? Most people today, when they're recording interviews, they're going to do a couple of things. They're going to use a computer or they're just going to use, their phone. And you get lots of cool stuff. If you're doing interviews, especially just one-on-one, like the little mic that I've got here, the lavalier mic, you can go on Amazon and buy a set that has a little plug-in like what I've got here and has 2 microphones. You could very easily record just on your phone or on a laptop and get pretty decent audio. Man, it used to be a nightmare to do this because you had these little like tape recorders with like a big microphone on the end and you had to prop them up on a stand. It used to be a complete nightmare to do this, especially in noisy circumstances. The technology is so much better today. Increasingly, a lot of people do interviews online just because of the ease for both people. You can assume people are in a private space because that's where they choose to be. And recording online interviews is an absolute snap, right? Most of the software now, whether it be Skype, Google Meet, Zoom, I don't know about FaceTime. I don't know if you can record FaceTime. It's probably not important right at this very moment. And yet, it's a question. I don't use Apple products as I would like to escape this world with my soul intact. Instead, I use products from an even more evil company called Google. But anyway, and Microsoft, so there you go. But yeah, whatever, just make sure whatever you're using, it has recording capabilities and you're going to get good sound, right? You might want to invest for yourself, at least in a microphone so you're hearing yourself well. And yeah, you want to use private and quiet settings for interviews. So sorry. This one can be tricky. Quiet makes sense, right? Because you want to be able to hear, especially on your recording that you're going to transcribe later. You want to be able to hear what people are saying without too much background noise. Too much background noise, and even the best mic, you're going to get gaps in your transcript where it's like inaudible, couldn't make it out or whatever it happens to be. Private is a little bit trickier in the sense that often you don't want, so private, but not too private. So, and obviously it depends on who you're talking to as well. Generally speaking, right, I would not advise anyone to say go into someone's house and interview them in their house. You generally want, that's very private, but depending on the circumstances, as a researcher, you could be putting yourself at a lot of risk of all sorts of things, accusations of inappropriate behavior, that kind of stuff. So you want it to be private, but also public. And I know that doesn't make any sense in a way, but a lot of people, that I've seen do this will rent like rooms at the public library, right? You would rent like a conference room at the public library. It's a very public place. There's people coming and going. There's usually windows where people can see into the room, but a door so you can close it, and then people can't hear what you're talking about. Obviously, online, online spaces are really good for this too. A Zoom or a Google Meet, very easy to have that privacy. Both people or whoever's in the group, if it's a focus group, find a quiet spot where they want to be on. And then, you both talk from a relatively safe space. But yeah, you want to be private, but not too private, especially if you are talking to vulnerable populations, right? You don't want, like kids, right? With kids, always, a kind of quasi-public space where you can shut the door, but people can still see you. So, honestly, if there's trying to think, like we have an office in the CCR, has a bunch of windows, right? You could be in there with someone and it's quiet, no one can hear what you're saying, but people could still see what you were doing with that person and there'd be people walking by. It's like public library or the libraries here if they have rooms with windows. And just make sure that you're, comfortable with the space and that other people are comfortable with it as well. Meet me at the public library is a good one. Cafes are less good, especially if you're talking about, relatively sensitive materials, right? Sensitive questions. People might not feel as comfortable being out in public. So it's a fine balance. You want to make sure that they have privacy, that you have good noise, not too much noise so that you can hear what they're saying. And when you record it, you can play it back easily, but not too private, right? You don't want to be in a place where you're isolated or where you're, in their home or something like that. So public, private, but also public would be kind of my advice on it. Okay. So good interviewing techniques. And here, what I would always recommend is if you have an idea of like a really good interviewer, and there's so many of them, right? Like there's so many great interviewers out there. Like the podcast space is such a beautiful space for getting familiar with interviewing techniques and hearing what works really well and what doesn't work well. Listen to a lot of interviews, right? And just pay attention to what the interviewer is doing, how they're asking questions, how they respond to what people are saying. I'm trying to think of like great interviewers. I don't know if she's still around because I stopped listening a while ago. There was Terry Gross. She hosted a podcast called Fresh Air, or a radio show called Fresh Air on NPR. She was an exceptionally good interviewer. Like I said, I don't know if she was elderly. I don't know if she's still around now, and because I kind of stopped listening to it a few years ago. You might not love her politics, but actually, like Megyn Kelly is a really good interviewer. She does a really, really good job interviewing people. Like she interviewed Donald Trump, and she did a really good job. Yeah, Brian.
Like, what is a way to kind of define a good interviewer versus a bad interviewer?
Okay, so, I mean, one of the things that there's a bunch of things that good interviewers will do, right? For one, they listen really closely to the person that's talking, right? And they don't, things like interrupting a lot is not a good thing. Interrupting at specific moments can be useful to get more information. So really close listening, they're responding to what the person is actually saying, right? Rather than, the worst interviewers have a point that they're trying to make, right? Rather than just responding and letting that person speak and presenting their views, they're trying to make a particular point, right? Really bad interviewers are often kind of ideologically motivated in some way, whatever that ideology is. And so they're trying to ask questions either to undermine or support their interviewee's position and make a point themselves, right? Rather than just responding to what the person says and letting that person speak. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a metaphor. I know I got in trouble with the tilting at windmills metaphor, but I guess if you're, metaphorically, if your interviewee is going to hang, you let them hang themselves, right? You don't participate in the hanging. And that's a terrible metaphor, and I'm sorry, it's very violent. But I'll say honestly, like if you go listen to the interview that Megyn Kelly did with Donald Trump from a few months ago, it's precisely what she did, right? She let Donald Trump speak and hang himself with his own words, right? He didn't actually hang for either good or ill. But does that kind of answer your question, right? It's a lot of active listening and reflecting and asking follow-up questions on what the person's actually saying and not having your own agenda, right? Just being able to take in what the person's saying. Now you can, obviously, when you're, I guess like as an interviewer, especially in an academic setting, you can impose your own agenda on those things when you're doing the narrative part, right? When you're constructing the story of what the interview data means, then you can kind of create your part of the story. But your role should be much more just listening, taking it in, following up, finding out what's interesting. But yeah, go ahead.
So a follow-up question then. How important is getting your point across clearly without pushing your own agenda and pushing the point you want to make?
Okay, so if I understand the question that you're asking, you're like, how important is it to like support your own position with like, or to like are you asking how to ask questions clearly, or?
I I think it's more of an aspect of like asking questions clearly, but like say I'm interviewing you,
Right.
and I'm saying like, oh, pigs can fly, and you're saying that no, pigs can't fly, and the interview and stuff, but like in my hypothesis, even though I know incorrect, right?
Okay.
But how can I like get like my point across?
So you're looking for information related to whether I believe pigs can fly?
Yes, in a positive sense.
Okay. I mean, I would probably. I mean, obviously, we've now picked an example that's going to be difficult to work with, but let's kind of think it through. Right. So I would say we'd be less interested in you making like a declarative statement, like pigs can fly, right? That would be. That's kind of a loaded question in that sense, right? You could ask, a question like that and let the person respond. It's like, so I've heard this account of basically flying pigs in southern Alberta, in Lethbridge. Probably the wind, right?
Yeah.
Maybe someone strapped a pair of wings on them. Who knows what happened? Tornadoes, Lethbridge, could be anything, right? Wicked Witch of the West. What do you think of that? Like, have you ever encountered a flying pig, or do you think flying pigs exist, right? So you're trying to get at like their perception without being like, telling them that, right.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I know it's a little bit of a weird example, but it's fine, right? Like even if you were trying to interview, I'm trying to think of an example, like climate deniers, right? And you don't agree with climate denialism, right? You're very much, a climate change believer. You still want to let those people express their views, right? So you wouldn't be like, so why don't you believe in climate change, right? That seems like a silly position, given all the scientific, blah, blah, blah. You'd be like, okay, what is your view of climate change? Like, and what evidence have you seen that climate change doesn't exist, right? Because you're trying to figure out why they view that particular phenomenon in that way. And you might, the whole time, so one of the grad students, her name's Ashley, she's doing this kind of research. Part of it is on climate denialism. And she'll say like half the time when she's talking to the climate denial folks, she's like, well, she wants to vomit, right? She just feels sick to her stomach. She hates it, but she always asks things in a really neutral way. Because the point is like, what do these people believe in? Why, right? If you're going to start unpack, and like, again, as part of that bigger research project, you can then be like, hey, this is why they believe it. This is where they're getting their information. This is why it's a problem, but not to them, right? And you definitely don't want to get into a debate, a debate with the people you're interviewing, because it's not. Then they're going to shut down, and you're not going to get any interesting information from them, right? Yeah, Joan.
Would you feel like the interviewee wants to question you, like wants to ask you something, like in a manner that like kind of would kind of spread the face?
I mean, I would dodge the question. As like you can give information, to a limited degree, but a lot of people just dodge. It's like, yeah, I understand that you really want to, maybe find out what I believe, but this interview is really about you and what you believe, right? And like, that's what I'm really interested in, is finding out, what you think, not what I think. I already know what I think, right? So rather than debate you, I just want to keep like getting more information, right? And again, that's maybe a clumsy way of doing it, but yeah, you should probably dodge and shift off of, if someone wants to engage you in a debate, just kind of pivot off of it, right? And just be like, yeah, I definitely have beliefs on this, but I don't really want to get into my beliefs because I'm interested in talking about your beliefs. I'm going to tell you a funny story, because weird things will happen in interviews, and this is not so much about like interview questions, but it kind of is related, because you sometimes have to think on your feet and be good at dodging things. So my boss, Sandra, who I talk about all the time, and she's fabulous, I swear, the greatest. She'll talk about when she's gone into prison and inmates will hit on her, right? And they'll be like, hey, well, maybe when I get out of prison, you and I could get together, right? And whatever people say, I don't know. And she'll like pivot off of that and be like, okay, look, we both know that's never going to happen, right? So can we just get back to the interview, please? And usually they'll kind of like calm down and be like, oh yeah, sure. She said in this, she always advises our grad students is like never ever flirt, like in a prison scenario, never flirt, or generally with your interviewees at all. Never flirt with them, just because it sets up a weird dynamic, and then people might be more interested in either impressing you, or worried they might say something that would like turn you off if they think they have a romantic shot with you. So just in general, never ever flirt with your interview participants. But yeah, I mean, just Sandra's way of just being like, okay, shutting it down, being like, yeah, it's not really about that. I really need to get this interview done. We're not going to like date afterwards. And it would be the same thing with like a climate denier. Be like, yeah, I don't really want to talk about my beliefs. I really want to talk about what you believe and where you got your information and all that stuff. Sorry, did I answer both of your questions?
Yes.
Okay, and you? All right. That was a long, rambling, incoherent response. Okay, as most of my responses tend to be. Okay, so yeah, being knowledgeable about the topic of study, and asking, so like I said, you want to make sure that you have some background knowledge. Even in something like climate denialism, you'd want to have a kind of basic sense of what sort of some of the theories out there are, so that you're not taken aback by them, so that you kind of recognize them when you see them, right? You don't want to be completely taken aback. You need to do some research, right? Even media interviewers have packets, like people give them packets of research so they know who they're talking to. You should know who you're talking to, and what they're likely to say is going to allow you to build better questions, for one thing. And you're less likely to get caught off balance by something someone says. Yeah, asking simple and understandable questions. Make sure your questions aren't too wordy. If you have to, because you're going to be asking a lot of unscripted questions, it's okay if you feel like your question's a bit rambly or the person looks confused, to just be like, let me rephrase, right? And then slow yourself down, take 2 deep breaths, and try to rephrase a question so that people understand better what you're trying to say, right? It's worse for someone to answer a convoluted question they didn't understand than for you to pause and maybe look a little silly and rephrase a question you didn't ask very well. Be gentle, sensitive, and open, so the interviewee can freely express their opinion and they're not interrupted, right? Don't be jumping in every 2 seconds. Listen to them, be open to what they're saying, whether you agree with it or not. Don't be overbearing in your interview style. But at the same time, so be flexible and steering. I'll erase this really quickly. You want to be flexible, but you also need to be in charge of the conversation. I know that sounds a little contradictory. If things get too far off topic, you have to be flexible enough to respond to new themes raised by the participant, right? So they're going to tell you things that you didn't know, things that you want to know more about, and you need to delve into that. You can't be too rigidly attached to your interview script, right? Or your interview guide. That's not going to get you in good places, because they're also going to feel like you don't listen to them. If they said something they think is really interested, and you're like, okay, so back to my list of questions, I don't know. I don't even know. I don't have an example, but you're constantly going back to your list of questions rather than responding to what they say. They're not going to like that very much, because they're looking for you to respond to things they said a little bit. But you also need to steer and redirect the discussion, because inevitably, and again, you're probably good at this already. That's the good news. You're probably good at this already because you've had conversations with people, with friends and family members that you had to redirect to, got way off topic, and you had to redirect to the thing you really wanted to talk about. So you're already good at this. But it's just about, like, if the conversation goes a little bit off the rails, you're there to bring it back on the rails, right? And you bring it back, and there your interview guide can be really useful, because you're like, okay, you notice the interview's gotten way off on a tangent, you can kind of bring it back to your interview guide. So, and you have to kind of know that balance between shutting people down and when people have wandered off so far from what you actually want to know. You're talking about climate change, and all of a sudden they're talking about their grandfather, crazy Eddie out in the bush, who counted the rings on trees, and that's how you know that climate change isn't really happening. Or something you're like, okay, that's not telling me anything. Time to bring it back to something else. Okay. All right, so the kinds of questions. So these are all important, and you should, I will say, I almost want to pause the audio, but I won't. Definitely know the types of questions because A, you're going to have to do them on your mini lab. You're going to have a variety of these on your major lab. And on the exam, there's a probable question that you're going to have to write some survey question, or sorry, not some survey questions, some interview questions, and you're going to have a few from these different types, right? So definitely, like, if you're wanting to, study these, know what they are, and you'll have a chance to practice writing some of them as you do your assignments. Okay. So there's a bunch of these. So two big kinds of questions. Introducing questions, right? Easy. Please tell me about when your interest in X began, right? How did it come that a guy from, London was working in the Russian television industry? Can you tell me how that happened, right? What was it about furries that initially interested you, right? All of these are introducing questions, right? You're introducing a topic. Now, typically, right, your first question of an interview is going to be an introducing question, but introducing questions can also happen in your topic areas, right? So when you hit a topic change, right, you want to talk about, how they got interested in furries. Okay, that's one question. What was their, and then you want to know about their first experience, at a furry convention. So it's like, can you tell me about the first time you went to a furry event, right? And then, anything, introducing questions, can you tell me about the first time someone in the media industry told you weren't allowed to say that, right? Anything like that. Can you tell me about when things changed for you? Like, these are all introducing questions, right? Okay. They're pretty simple. Follow-up questions. So follow-up questions are, they're hard to script because generally you do them as a response to something that someone said. So they're really, really difficult to script, but it can be something to the effect of, you rephrase the interviewee's answer and ask them to elaborate. So, you said that you don't believe in climate change because, I'm trying to remember my climate change conspiracy theories. I don't know. You don't believe in climate change because the planet used to be much hotter than it is today, in the past, and everything was fine. Could you tell me, how you came to that belief, right? How did you come to understand this, right? Or that's probably not a great example. When you say that, the first time you saw a furry, you were enraptured by what they look like. Can you tell me more about that, right? Can you tell me why you were enraptured or whatever it happens to be, right? So it's just often like a rephrase to get more information, right? You're probing, you're wanting to get more information about something they said. They said something interesting. Can you tell me more about that, right? What did you mean by that? Why, all of that kind of stuff. So, sorry, does those two make sense? They're pretty straightforward. Okay. So probing questions, very similar to follow-up questions. And again, they are tough to script. But, generally, they're short. And you usually open up space to talk more about a specific subject, right? So, what do you mean by that? Like, if someone says, I really hate how the liberals think they can stop climate change, it's all a conspiracy theory, right? You could be like, oh, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean? Really simple. And then they'll tell you about Carl Schwab and the World Economic Forum or something, right? Whatever it happens to be. Or obviously, can you give me an example, right? And you can do the rephrase on probing questions. You said this. Can you give me an example of a time that happened, right? Trying to think of a example on the fly. You said your experiences with furries were the best thing that ever happened to you, and so much more life affirming than than when you interact with normies, right? Can you give me an example of a time that happened and a time that you felt that way, right? So you're asking them to show you a little bit more detail, or just the, how so, or anything, right? It can be a lot of different ways. Okay, so that's probing questions. Like I said, they're hard to script, and you might just when you're setting up a kind of interview guide, just kind of jot down, some probing responses, so phrases like, what do you mean by this? Can you give me an example? How so? Once you have them in your head, you don't even really need them on paper, but it can just give you an idea of what you can possibly say. Okay, specifying questions, typically looking for factual information. It can be, like, what did you do then is obviously an example of that. Like, okay, you went, sorry, I got a song in my head all of a sudden. Went down to the Mississippi looking for love. Okay, or went down to the sanctuary looking for love. What did you do then, right? Well, I went into the gas station to buy a pack of cigarettes. Oh, what happened then, right? I went to the furry convention because I really wanted to experience, what it was like to be in furry culture. And it was, and I was amazed. Oh, what did you do? What happened then? What happened when you went in? What was that experience like, right? You want to get them to give you some details on a specific event, right? So sometimes it's just a prompt to keep them talking. What did you do then? What happened next? How did you react, right? That would be a specifying question. How did they react when you told them that, right? Or what did you do when you found out that climate change was all just a hoax concocted by Carl Schwab to get rid of cows, right? Like, I'm not sure if that's even a real conspiracy theory. I may just be making things up now. But yeah, you're just looking for more details, especially about factual events, like follow-up. What did they do? What did it mean? How did they interpret it? All of that kind of stuff. Okay. Direct questions are really easy. Direct questions, interviewee perception. Do you find it easy to keep smiling when serving customers? Do you like coming to introduction to social methods? Do you find that the instructor is of high quality? Do you want fries with that? No, it's a direct question, but it's not an interview question. Right, they're really just about interviewee perception. You're asking them a direct question about something like, do you think, Canada is a good place to live, right? That's a direct question. Some people will say that it's best to leave direct questions towards the middle to end of an interview, just to not guide the process too much. I've never found that, honestly, that to be overly necessary, but, that's what some people say. Okay, so do direct questions make sense? Okay, indirect questions are harder. And by the way, this is the one that people almost always get wrong, both in the labs and on the exam, because they are the trickiest. Because what you're really asking, so if you remember when I was talking about survey questions, I talked about the neighbor question, right, which is a really interesting and useful tool for getting at what people actually think when there might be some social desirability bias. The indirect question is kind of the same thing, right? So instead of asking, are you going to vote for Donald Trump? You ask, do you think your neighbors are going to vote for Donald Trump? And because most people's neighbors are kind of similar to them, there's a good chance that, or people in your community, do you think people in your community are going to blah, 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 right? People might be more honest if you kind of depersonalize it a little bit. So the indirect question, again, is often aimed at two things: what the person really thinks, and what they think other people think, which is a reflection in a lot of cases as to what they think themselves, but might not be willing to say, right? So, how do you feel about, it's a kind of not, it's an indirect question. Like, how do you feel about, the prime minister, right? That's kind of a direct-ish question. A much better indirect question would be something like, What do oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
So just, you said 2 points, and for clarification on the second,
Mm-hmm.
you were saying, what do you think other people think of your perspective, or what do you think other people's perspectives are?
It's more the second one.
Okay.
Yeah. So like this question, like what do most people around here think of the way management treats its staff, right? You're asking, it kind of includes them, but it's meant to be broader than that. So they're thinking like, how does, I don't know, if you're at a Starbucks, right? How do most people feel about the management, right? You're asking them to tell you what they think other people think. So you're sort of asking, indirectly about management, right? How management treats its staff through asking the perception of other people. Like, what do most people in your community think about, I'm trying to think of an issue, abortion, right? If you wanted to know about abortion and people's views of abortion, you could ask what they think, most people in their community thinks about, abortion rights or whatever it happens to be, right? Or about Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau. So you're not directly asking them what they think. You're asking them, what people around them think. So yeah, people around them. Or kind of at a remove. Now, again, this sometimes gets around social desirability bias a little bit. Because they can tell you, in a broader sense without being like, I really hate Justin Trudeau. They can be like, people I know really hate Justin Trudeau, and these are the reasons why, right? So you can get at sometimes, some pretty sensitive information based not so much on them having to admit something, but telling you about the people who are around them. So like, if you wanted to ask about, because we were talking about this in sociology of youth this morning, pornography use, right? You could ask an indirect question about it because people might be too embarrassed to say that they, regularly consume adult content, but they might be perfectly willing to tell you that all of their friends regularly consume adult content. Now, how would they know that? I don't know. Now I've drifted into a weird place, but I'm trying to think of like where sensitive questions would come. Questions about religion can be really sensitive. All that. Political views, people might not want to open up about it because it can be a little dicey and there can be some social desirability bias. So sometimes putting it at a remove, like what do other people think, or what does this group of people that you're a part of think about X, right, can be a really useful way of sort of setting that up. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. This guy, he's being interviewed hard. Oh, sorry, I have those again. Why do I have these twice? I don't know. These are much more nicely illustrated. Okay, sorry. I skipped a bunch of slides, which means, Joan, guess what that means?
Yay.
It means we have less slides than I thought. Okay. Structuring questions. All right, so structuring questions are really easy. Again, kind of like introducing questions. Sometimes you want to move to a different topic. So honestly, like, I'd like to move to a different topic. I just want to get back to something, a different topic or a different subject. I really, now I'd like to move on to, your personal biography, or now I'd like to move on to your family, right? Tell me how your family feels about you being a furry or you being a climate denier or any of those kinds of things, right? So structuring questions, just like they're often a rephrase. It's like this topic that we've got off topic, so now, okay, well, thanks for telling me that. I'd like to now move on to a different topic. So pretty easy. Okay, silence. So, yeah, sorry, I thought of a funny, to me it was funny. It's like you don't have to write any silence when you're writing an interview script, and I won't ask you to put just a blank space on your exam. Silence is really important in interviews. You have to give people a chance. Like, okay, I'm a nervous, rambly kind of person in general. This one's really hard for me because if someone's not talking, I want to jump in and like prompt them some more, give them more to think about. You know, fill the silence so they don't feel uncomfortable. But sometimes, you know, you honestly just have to, if you know what that means. And let people take a breath. Like, especially if you ask, a question they have to think about, something that might be a little bit uncomfortable. Give them space to think about it without you peppering them. Like I said, I'm super bad for this. I'm the guy who doesn't shut up, obviously. My class is where I ask people to respond. If no one responds, I just keep talking. And then I answer my own question. It's very awkward. You know. So, but yeah, you don't want to pause so long that people feel embarrassed. Like, you know, give them a 30 seconds, a minute at most. You know, and if they'll usually tell you if they're not sure about something or they don't have anything to say about it, you know, but give them a little bit of space to think and take a breath, especially on tough questions. You should you know, again, not something I'm good at in the slightest. Okay, interpreting questions. Again, interpreting questions are kind of a rephrase in some sense. You're pivoting off something that someone said. You know, do you mean that your leadership role had to change from one of encouraging to more of a directive one? You know, do you mean that this happened, right? You're trying to provide an interpretation, right? If someone said something, again, it's kind of a rephrase. You're like, you want to clarify if you got the meaning right, if you're understanding their meaning. So you're like, okay, when you say that, you know, being a furry opened up new possibilities for you, do you mean like you felt like you were able to be freer, you were happier, you had more possibilities for your identity? You know, so you're kind of interpreting what you think they mean and turning it into a question, and you're looking for confirmation from them that you're correctly understanding what they're trying to say, right? So the interpreting question. I am interpreting what you said as this. Is that correct? Right? It would be basically what you're looking for, though that's a very mechanical phrasing of it. So, pretty straightforward. Okay, are we all good with the question types? Good? Okay. Okay, I have lots of slides left. I was worried I was running out of slides. Okay, so, yeah, listen. So back to kind of what I was talking about with Brian, you know, a second ago. Listen. Your primary job in the interview is to listen, not to impose your views, not to challenge people. You know, if you want to challenge people, get a podcast. It's not what an academic interview is. In a podcast, you can like yell at people or do it on YouTube, do a React video, whatever. You know, in an interview, your primary goal is to listen to your interviewees, record what they're saying, ask them interesting follow-ups, get information out of them. You know, it's not for you to talk. You should be talking as little as possible, right? And you should be putting in your own experiences as little as possible, within reason, right? You can vibe with a person to an extent. You can, you know, be like, yeah, I experienced something similar, but you don't want the conversation to become about you. And we all have a tendency to do this, right? We all have a tendency sometimes to make conversations about us. But in this case, you have to resist, because the reason you're talking to this person, theoretically, is you're really interested in what they have to say. Yeah, don't harm people. You know, avoid bringing anxiety to the interviewees. You know, some of this comes with, if you're talking about really, I don't know what's happening, but it sounds like something's going to explode. Okay. Possibly Joan's patience with me. Okay, that went a while ago. Good. We're already past that point. You know, you can, if you're talking about sensitive topics, it's in your consent letter, and before you start the interview, that you can give people like warnings and disclaimers, you know, and tell them that they don't have to answer any of your questions if they feel uncomfortable, just to let you know. And again, your goal is, because it's ethics, right? Don't do harm. You know, you don't want to re-traumatize people. You want to let people tell you about their experiences without, you know, reliving maybe some of the worst things they've experienced. And depending on what you're studying, right? You could be studying something super fun that has no trauma. You could be talking about, prisons if you're doing stuff in criminology, or drugs or gangs and stuff that could be very, very traumatic. So you don't want to re-traumatize people or traumatize them with your questions. And if you feel like they're getting agitated with your questioning, it's okay to take a step back, or even ask them, like, are you okay? Like, I know this is a sensitive subject. Would you like us to move on to something else? And they could be like, no, it's fine. I want to talk about this. Or, yeah, this is too much for me, right? And it's okay to check in with them. I know, like, you have to be empathetic. And if you notice people are getting anxious or frustrated, just, you can back off, or you can check. You can check with them and see how they're doing. And most people will be really honest about it, for the most part. Okay, in this last style, one last style of question that you can think about. They're a little hard to use sometimes because you have to have a good vignette. But vignette questions, basically, it's like a little story question. And you've probably seen someone, like a professor, use these on an exam for a multiple choice test, where it's like, Sarah is a first-year sociology student. She's interested in studying, deviance because she believes that, deviance comes from strain. Whose perspective is she most in line with, right? This is a vignette, right? It's a little story. I'm telling you a story about Sarah. Sarah doesn't exist. But you can set up a little story, basically to kind of ground people's kind of perceptions. Like, you tell them a story of someone who, and it could be a real life story, like, you don't have to make it up. You can present a scenario, something that might happen. What would you do in this situation, right? Like, if there was another trucker convoy and they were on their way to Ottawa, what would you do? Would you join them, right? Or would you counter protest against them? Or just what would you do, right? Don't give them scenarios. If this happened, right? If you saw this happening, what would you do? These sorts of things. You can set up a little story and then let them tell you about it, and then ask them, why would they do that? All of those sorts of things, right? So vignette questions, sometimes it can be useful. Again, it gets people out of their own heads a little bit, in the sense that suddenly you're giving them something real world and practical to think about. So it can be, the scenario can get people to think about what they would do, what they would say, what their perception of this is, in a way, outside of just, their recollections. So they can be useful. Like I said, I use them all the time on exams, but that's neither here nor there. Okay. So after the interview, field notes, exclamation mark. Essentially, so all that this is talking about is field notes following an interview. It can be really simple, it can be really in-depth, right? So you can have, and sometimes people take notes as they're doing interviews. I never found I was able to, because I really wanted to be listening to the person I was talking to. But sometimes people do, like, very quick scratch notes, like on their interview guide, being like, okay, Tom is getting agitated as I ask this question, right? Or something like that. And you can use that to build kind of field notes. But basically, following the interview, you want to make a little, whatever length you want, how the interview went. Like, what's your reflection on the interview? How do you feel like it went? Is there anything, you might want to note anything that was touchy, anything that was difficult, any questions that didn't work, and why, where it was conducted, that should be really simple. Other feelings or issues raised during the interview, anything that you thought about, anything, that was notable, what was going on around the interview, right? So if you were, I don't know, like, just say, for instance, that you were doing the interview on Zoom and your interviewee kept getting disconnected and have to join back in, and they were getting frustrated or whatever, right? You want to note any of that stuff down. Or if, like, suddenly a gaggle, you were doing your interviews at the public library, like that stupid Professor Broussard told you should do, and a gaggle of loud children go by, and it kind of breaks your concentration, and the interview kind of went sideways after that. Just note that down, right? Anything that was going on, anything that's interesting, important. If there's anything about the person you were interviewing, their deportment, their tone, that you think is really interesting, make sure you note that down. Again, so that you can remember it later. So that when you go to write up an account, and it could be months or years before you use this again, and you might come back to that data, right? Let's say you do a bunch of interviews, you write a journal article today, 5 years later, you might come back and look at your data again. So you really want to remember what the heck was going on. And again, they don't have to be long. It could be like half a page, a couple sentences, bullet points, whatever you want, right? Whatever, like there's no right or wrong. There's no like academic procedure for what a perfect field note is. It's for your memory and, reminding you what was going on. Okay. I mean, I won't belabor these, right? These are just things that you could talk about if you're looking for categories like values. What do they care about? Beliefs. What do they think? Like, what do they actually believe? Behaviors. What do they do? What roles do they have? What relationships are they in? Do you want to know about specific places, about their neighborhood, about their church, about their synagogue, mosque, university, school, prison, right? C block at the prison, whatever. How they felt, people they've encountered, and stories they have to tell, right? And, these should all stories is going to link to all these other categories. But if there's a really interesting anecdote that they have, right, those are usually really valuable. Yeah, I could pull some out of interviews I've done that were really fun, but just like people will give you these really, I'm trying to think. I had one interview where a guy was telling me about, some of the challenges with working in Russia, specifically in the TV industry, and brought out, what was it, the story of a series, was Wife Swap. I think he was talking about the Russian version of Wife Swap. And he had all these really interesting stories to illustrate it. Like, I think I had asked the follow-up question, like, oh, well, could you give me an example of when that happened? He's like, oh yeah, when I was working on Wife Swap in Russia. This is, once they ran out of money because they'd stolen half the budget, they just stopped filming and handed me a bunch of footage to put together into a show, and it was basically unusable. And he told a bunch of stories about how this had happened. It was really, really fun. But yeah, the stories are the best. You get such illustrative examples. And then the beautiful thing about when someone tells you a story is you can usually pull quotes or whole like blocks of text out. So if you're trying to write a lengthy article, block quoting is very useful. Yeah, Brian.
This is off topic, but do you speak Russian?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do speak. I learned it in university. Oh. My professor, Elena Siemens, who's fabulous, is still here. And we're still like best of friends. So yes, I took it starting in 2001, and then I went and lived in St. Petersburg for a year at the end of my degree, which is a fabulous place. But Russia's weird. The less said about Russia, the best, probably. Okay, so I just want to see how many slides I have left. Oh, wow. Okay, maybe what I'll do is I'll stop at focus groups. Because focus groups are a beast in and of themselves, and it'll be a good place to start on Monday. They're interviews, but they're slightly different because it's in a group. So we'll stop there. Well, I'll go for a few more slides. This one's really, really, really easy. Okay, use an electronic recorder or some kind of recorder. You should, okay, I mean, you have to ask permission to record your interviews, and in very rare circumstances, people will say no. And then you just kind of have to do your best to reconstruct like notes afterwards as to what they said, right? It sucks if someone does this to you. It's never happened to me, but it's happened to friends of mine. We're like, could I record this interview? And the person's like, no. And then you're like, you do the interview, and then you're trying to jot down notes furiously and reconstruct kind of a general script of the interview. It sucks. But in most cases, people are fine with you recording things, as long as they know that you're going to keep it confidential. You need to have their consent, and usually, it'd be like, you would chit chat with them for a few minutes, introduce yourself, and be like, okay, I'm going to start recording now. Is that okay? And they're going to be like, yeah, that's fine. Okay. Now, the worst part of the entire research process, in my opinion, because I freaking hate it more than I hate anything else, including the Toronto Maple Leafs, so that's saying quite a bit, who I hate with every fiber of my being. But transcription sucks. And basically, it's you listening back to your interviews and typing them out. There's a bunch of, it's expensive, it's slow. To do 1 hour of text, you're looking at probably if you're quick at it, 5 to 6 hours. Some training is required sometimes, and sometimes even special equipment. I know our people who do it have what's called a transcription pedal, which is just like, rather than like you pausing and unpausing the audio, you have a foot pedal, so you can pause and unpause. You have to rewind a million times if you missed what someone's saying. You need really good headphones because you have to be able to hear the audio really clearly. It is literally the worst thing in the universe. Worse than famine, no, it's okay, I'm exaggerating, but I hate it a lot. I cheated. I'm going to confess something to you that I confess every year, but I 100% cheated on transcription. I was supposed to do it myself, but I did half of my first of 20 interviews, and it took me it was like a 3-hour interview, and I was like 2 full days of my time to get half of it done, and then I paid a transcription service online to do it for me. I cheated. It was not ethical because technically it was not allowed under my ethics, but I did it anyway. So yeah, super fun. It's called rev.com. And basically they charge you, it's about 50 cents a minute for transcription, and their transcription's pretty good. And oh my God, it's so fast. I would send them 3-hour interviews or like focus groups that were like 2 hours long, and they would have it transcribed within 24 hours. It was amazing, and I loved it. I hate transcribing. It is the worst. So it's really expensive. It's really time consuming if you do it yourself. It's mind numbing. The one advantage of it is you get to know your data really, really well because you hear every single sentence that a person utters like 20 times. So you know your interviews backwards and forwards. And yet I would still suggest that you don't do it yourself. And if you can build it into your ethics, that you're going to pay a third-party transcriber to do the transcription for you, absolutely do that, because transcribing is a nightmare. I had no problem going back and listening to my interviews when I would go for a walk or running on my phone, but transcribing it drove me crazy because you would do 10 seconds of text, type, pause, unpause. Oh, did I get that wrong? Back up. It was a nightmare. I didn't have a transcription pedal either, so maybe that was the problem. I hate transcribing. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess like in an interview, vary the order of your questions. I've kind of talked about that before. Be flexible, right? And it's also important in audio, if audio recording equipment breaks down, you should have a backup, right? Always have some kind of backup. Or if someone refuses to let you record, you're going to have to kind of roll with the punches. So flexibility is really important. And yeah, know when to turn on and off your equipment. Just let people know. It's important to let people know that when you're switching the recorder off, that now anything they say is off the record. So if they, if anything that they tell you after that point, you're not going to, you're not going to include it. So just let people know when you're starting, when you're stopping, what's on the record, what's off the record. It's really, it's just courteous to your interviewees. Okay, I think this is the last one we'll do, and then we'll call it quits for today. Yeah, reflexivity when transcribing and analyzing. So you can reflect, on how your interactions with the participant could have affected what was said, right? You can notice, did you ask leading questions? Did you end up in leading questions? Did your enthusiasm for a particular topic area cause them to maybe exaggerate? Go and take the conversation in a particular direction. You kind of, as you're transcribing or listening over to your audio, you can think of, what role you played, what was said, how it was said, your role in the construction of that conversation. And then what was left unsaid, were there topics that they were specifically avoiding or that you were, things that you need to follow up on, and all that jazz. Okay, I think that's probably enough for today. Joan, is that enough for today? I mean, you were ready to call it after 1 minute, and I hadn't said anything, and PowerPoint broke down, but... Okay. We'll call that a day, because focus groups are their own, and I think fairly involved topic. It's best to probably keep it all together, which we'll do on Monday, and all that jazz. So next Tuesday, you do have a lab. No assignment this week, obviously. So yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Other than that, we'll see you next week. Okay, off I go. I know we're meeting, Lila. Just give me 2 seconds. I just need to run to the washroom. Do you want to meet me over at my office? Yeah, you betcha. I'll be there in like